In 1956, the Packard Motor Car Company was America's most prestigious luxury automobile manufacturer. For 50 years, it had built cars for presidents, movie stars, and titans of industry. The Packard was the car you bought when you had made it, when you wanted the world to know you had arrived. By 1958, the company was dead, bankrupt, erased from the American automotive landscape entirely. This is the story of Packard, and how pride, poor decisions, and a series of catastrophic miscalculations destroyed one of the greatest names in automotive history. Along the way, we'll encounter corporate betrayal, desperate mergers, cars that should never have worn the Packard name, and a management team that seemed determined to run the company into the ground. So let us begin. But first, how did Packard become America's greatest luxury car in the first place? The Packard story starts in 1899 in Warren, Ohio. James Ward Packard was an engineer who had recently purchased a Winton automobile, one of the first commercially available cars in America, and he hated it. The thing broke down constantly. Packard complained to Alexander Winton himself, who reportedly told him that if he thought he could do better, he should build his own car. So he did. James Packard and his brother William founded the Ohio Automobile Company in 1899, and by 1900 they had produced their first vehicle. It was better than the Winton, much better. The company was renamed Packard Motor Car Company in 1902, and by 1903 they had moved to Detroit, the emerging center of the American automobile industry. Now, here's the thing about early Packard. From the very beginning, James Packard made a decision that would define the company for the next 5 decades. He wasn't interested in building cars for everyone. He wanted to build the best cars, period. Let other companies fight over the mass market. Packard would serve the wealthy, the discriminating, the people who demanded excellence and were willing to pay for it. And it worked. By the 1910s, Packard had established itself as America's premier luxury automobile manufacturer. The cars were expensive, beautifully crafted, and mechanically superior to almost anything else on the road. Packard's advertising slogan said it all. Ask the man who owns one. That wasn't just marketing, it was confidence. Packard didn't need to explain why their cars were better, they just were, and everyone knew it. By the 1920s, Packard was the undisputed king of American luxury cars. Presidents rode in Packards, royalty rode in Packards. When the Soviet Union wanted to build a limousine for Joseph Stalin, they bought a Packard and reverse-engineered it. Think about that. The dictator of the Soviet Union trusted Packard engineering with his life. The Twin Six, introduced in 1916, was America's first production V12 engine. The cars were works of art, with hand-finished bodies, the finest materials, and engineering that was years ahead of the competition. Owning a Packard meant something. It meant you had arrived at the very top of American society. And then came the Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 devastated the luxury car market. Wealthy Americans suddenly weren't so wealthy anymore, and even those who still had money weren't eager to be seen driving around in expensive automobiles while their neighbors were standing in breadlines. Sales of high-end cars collapsed. Packard faced a choice. They could ride out the storm, cut costs, and hope the luxury market recovered, or they could adapt. They chose to adapt. In 1935, Packard introduced the 120, a medium-price car aimed at the upper middle class rather than the truly wealthy. It was a gamble. Many in the company feared that building cheaper cars would dilute the Packard name, that customers who had paid top dollar for a Packard would resent sharing the badge with people who had paid much less. But the company was bleeding money, and something had to change. The 120 was a massive success. Sales exploded. Packard went from selling around 6,000 cars a year to selling nearly 60,000. The company was profitable again. Crisis averted. Or was it? See, here's where the seeds of Packard's destruction were planted. The 120 saved the company in the short term, but it changed what Packard meant. Before the 120, a Packard on the street was a rare thing. a sign of true wealth and taste. After the 120, Packards were everywhere. Your dentist drove a Packard. Your insurance agent drove a Packard. The mystique was fading. The company tried to maintain the distinction. The senior Packards, the big luxurious ones, were still clearly superior to the junior models. But the damage was done. The brand had been democratized, and once you let the masses into the club isn't quite as exclusive anymore. Still, Packard remained a major player in the American automobile industry through the late 1930s. They were profitable. They were respected. And then World War II changed everything. During the war, Packard stopped making cars entirely. Like every other American manufacturer, they converted to military production. Packard built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines for P-51 Mustang fighter planes and PT boat engines for the Navy. They did important work, excellent work, but they also fell behind. The thing about wartime production is that it freezes your civilian product development. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler had massive resources. They could maintain skeleton crews working on post-war designs, even while their factories churned out tanks and planes. Packard couldn't. They were too small. Every engineer, every designer was focused on the war effort. So when the war ended in 1945, the Big Three were ready with new designs. Packard wasn't. They rushed their pre-war designs back into production, making minor updates but nothing substantial. It was supposed to be temporary, just a stopgap until the real new models were ready. But the real new models kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, back to Packard. The post-war car market was unlike anything America had ever seen. Soldiers were coming home. They had money in their pockets. They wanted cars, desperately. Demand was so high that manufacturers could sell literally anything with four wheels and an engine. Packard sold plenty of cars in the late 1940s, but they were selling warmed-over pre-war designs to customers who would have bought anything. The company was making money, but they were falling behind, and they knew it. The problem was what to do about it. In 1948, Packard finally introduced genuinely new post-war cars. They were fine. Not revolutionary, not the technological leaders that pre-war Packards had been. Just fine. The design was controversial. Some people loved it. Others thought the cars looked pregnant. The famous pregnant elephant critique was harsh, but not entirely unfair. More importantly, Packard was still trying to be two things at once. They were still building both senior and junior cars, still trying to serve both the luxury market and the medium-priced market, and they were doing neither particularly well. The luxury market was changing. Cadillac had emerged from the war as a powerhouse. General Motors had resources that Packard simply couldn't match. They could spend more on styling, more on engineering, more on marketing. Cadillac was becoming the new symbol of American success, and Packard was struggling to keep up. Meanwhile, in the medium-priced market, Packard was competing against Buick, Oldsmobile, Chrysler, and a dozen other brands, all of which had the backing of much larger corporations. It was a brutal fight, and Packard was bringing a knife to a gunfight. By the early 1950s, Packard's market share was declining steadily. The company was still profitable, but barely. The writing was on the wall. Something had to change dramatically, or Packard would slowly fade into irrelevance. Enter James Nance. In 1952, Packard hired James Nance away from General Electric's Hot Point division to serve as president. Nance was a marketing genius, a dynamic executive who promised to restore Packard to its former glory. He had a plan, an ambitious plan, a plan that would either save the company or destroy it. Nance believed that Packard's fundamental problem was that it was too small. The Big Three had economies of scale that Packard simply couldn't match. They could spread their development costs across millions of vehicles. Packard was spreading theirs across tens of thousands. The math didn't work. The solution, Nance believed, was consolidation. If the independent automakers, the companies outside the Big Three, could join forces, they might be able to compete. Nash and Hudson had already merged to form American Motors. Nance wanted to create something even bigger. His vision was a fourth major American automaker that would combine Packard, Studebaker, and possibly others into a company large enough to challenge the Big Three. It was bold, it was ambitious, and it was probably the only way Packard could survive long term. In 1954, Packard merged with Studebaker to form the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. On paper, it looked like a marriage of equals. Packard was the prestigious luxury brand. Studebaker was the scrappy independent with a loyal following. Together, they would be stronger than either could be alone. The reality was very different. Studebaker was in far worse shape than Packard realized. Their South Bend, Indiana factory was old and inefficient. Their labor costs were among the highest in the industry. They had been losing money for years and had hidden the extent of their problems during merger negotiations. Packard had married a corpse. This would prove to be catastrophic. Instead of Packard absorbing Studebaker and using its resources to strengthen both brands, Studebaker's problems dragged Packard down. Money that should have gone to developing new Packards instead went to keeping the Studebaker factory running. The promised synergies never materialized. The merger that was supposed to save Packard was killing it. Meanwhile, Nance was also making decisions about Packard's product line that would alienate the company's core customers. He decided that Packard needed to refocus on the luxury market, to stop chasing the medium-price segment and concentrate on what Packard did best. In theory, this made sense. In practice, it was disastrous. The 1955 and 1956 Packards were beautiful cars. They featured torsion-level suspension, an innovative system that kept the car level regardless of road conditions. The styling was modern and distinctive. The engineering was, in many ways, ahead of its time. These were genuinely excellent automobiles, but they were also expensive to build. The torsion-level suspension was complex and costly. The unique Packard bodies couldn't share parts with Studebaker, so they had to be produced in small quantities at high per-unit costs. Packard was losing money on every car they sold, and sales were disappointing. The luxury market had largely moved on. Cadillac and Lincoln had captured the buyers who, a generation earlier, would have automatically chosen Packard. The Packard name, once synonymous with excellence, now seemed like a relic of the past. Younger buyers didn't have the same emotional connection to the brand that their parents had. By 1956, the situation was desperate. Packard closed its Detroit factory entirely. The company that had built cars in Detroit since 1903 was done manufacturing there. The remaining Packards would be built in South Bend, at the Studebaker factory. And this is where the tragedy becomes farce. The 1957 and 1958 Packards weren't really Packards at all. They were Studebakers with different grills and trim. The company called them Packard Clippers, but everyone knew what they were. Studebakers in disguise. Badge-engineered pretenders wearing a name they hadn't earned. I mean, honestly, this is kind of heartbreaking. A company that had built cars for presidents and kings was now slapping its legendary name on warmed-over economy cars. The 1958 Packard Hawk was particularly sad. It was based on the Studebaker Golden Hawk, itself a decent car, but dressed up with a bizarre fiberglass nose and fake hood scoop that fooled absolutely no one. Customers who remembered what Packard used to mean were appalled. Customers who didn't remember had no reason to pay a premium for a rebadged Studebaker. Sales were abysmal. The 1957 Packard sold fewer than 5,000 units. The 1958 sold fewer than 3,000. In July 1958, Studebaker Packard announced that the Packard name would be discontinued. After 59 years, one of America's greatest automotive brands was dead. So what happened? How did a company that was once synonymous with American excellence fall so far, so fast? The easy answer is the merger with Studebaker. And that's certainly part of it. Packard married a dying company and got dragged down with it. But the rot had set in long before 1954. The real decline began in the 1930s with the 120. When Packard decided to chase volume instead of prestige, they planted the seeds of their own destruction. They diluted their brand. They confused their customers. They tried to be everything to everyone and ended up being nothing to anyone. After the war, the mistakes compounded. Packard was too slow with new designs. They let Cadillac steal their thunder. They failed to invest in the modern facilities they needed to compete. And when they finally realized they were in trouble, they made a desperate deal with a company that was in even worse trouble. But I think the deepest problem was cultural. Packard had been successful for so long that they couldn't imagine a world where they weren't successful. They believed their own legend. They thought the Packard name alone would carry them through any difficulty. It wouldn't. The world had changed, and Packard hadn't changed with it. The customers who remembered when Packard was the pinnacle of American automobiles were dying off. Their children and grandchildren didn't care about tradition. They wanted modern, stylish, powerful cars, and Cadillac was giving them exactly that. Packard's management wasn't stupid. James Nance, in particular, was a capable executive who understood the company's problems. But understanding problems and solving them are different things. Nance didn't have the resources to compete with General Motors. Nobody outside the Big Three did. His merger strategy was probably the right idea, but he chose the wrong partner, and by the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. And what of the people who watched Packard die? James Nance resigned from Studebaker Packard in 1956, before the final humiliation of the badge-engineered cars. He went on to have a successful career in other industries, but Packard remained his great failure. He had come to save the company, and instead presided over its destruction. The Packard workers who lost their jobs when the Detroit factory closed in 1956 scattered to the winds. Some found work at other automakers. Others left the industry entirely. The specialized skills they had developed building Packards were suddenly worthless. The Packard customers, the loyal owners who had believed in the brand, were left with orphaned cars. Parts became difficult to find. Dealers closed. The club that had once meant so much, the community of Packard owners, slowly dissolved. Today, Packards are prized collector cars. The pre-war models especially command enormous prices at auction. There's a thriving community of enthusiasts who restore and maintain these machines, who keep the memory of what Packard once was alive. But the company itself is gone. The Detroit factory where Packards were built for over 50 years is now a ruin, slowly being reclaimed by nature. The South Bend plant where the final sad Packards were assembled was demolished in 2013. What remains is the legend, the memory of a time when Packard meant something, when it meant the best. When "Ask the man who owns one" wasn't just a slogan, but a statement of fact. And that is the story of Packard, a company that had everything, that built the finest cars America had ever seen, and threw it all away through pride, bad decisions, and an inability to change with the times. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more. And let me know in the comments, had you heard of Packard before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.